Thank you very much. Okay, covenant. So, the Catholic Church is really good at not letting us off the hook. We have thought about this, and we know human nature, and we know all of the ways we're going to try to rationalize ourselves into a bad act. So, one of the ways that we've already thought about, so don't try it, is saying, it's okay, I didn't actually do it. Well, maybe. Depends. So, cooperation is participating in somebody else's sin. For the sake of this, let's talk about a bank robbery. Alright, so, I don't know, my professor used the abortion example, which is a little more hard-hitting, and I don't necessarily want to go there, so I'm going to try to use the bank robbery example, and we'll talk about abortion in week 4. Bank robbery, form of cooperation is doing the thing and wanting to do it with them. So, you're in the vault, right there next to the guy doing it, and you're like, this is great, I'm really excited to be here. Like, maybe you didn't jump in on it to begin with, but you were there, and you know, you were on the ground, and you're like, hey, can I just like help you guys? Formal cooperation, you have formally cooperated, you have done the act, and wanted to do it. It gets harder when you don't actually want to do the act, because you have this intention thing again. So, material cooperation is when you still participate in the act in some way, shape, or form, right? Still an evil act, but you don't intend it. So, one example is if you have a gun held to your head. That is still material cooperation, right? You're still doing the evil act, but you don't intend it, right? It's a reservation, and actually it's a reservation to the level of, let's call it an impediment of the will. So there's really not any voluntariness there. Here, that's less so. So material cooperation in a bank robbery, you know, might be not to the level of having a gun to your head, but to the level of, I don't know, like a Bonnie and Clyde example. Let's say Bonnie didn't want to do it, and Clyde's like, we're doing it! She's like, I don't want to do it, but I'll do it because I don't want you to run away. So like, she does it. Formally, right there, adds material cooperation, even though she doesn't want to do it. But she's still right there next to him the whole time. I think I got that. Bonnie's the girl, right? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Or are they both girls? No. No, that's Selma and Louise. Okay. So, that's material cooperation, and that's immediate material cooperation. So you do the deed itself. You're right there. It's immediate. Then we have mediate. So there's a step or two between you and the act. So let's say somebody wants to rob a house, and you're at your neighbor's house. You don't really like the neighbor, but you don't want him to be robbed either. So you're not really intending the act. And you're out there cleaning your gutters. And the robber's like, hey, I got to get into this guy's window. Can I use your ladder? That's material cooperation, because you have provided material necessary for the act, but it's mediate. You're not doing the act, you're separated from it, and you didn't really want it to happen, but the guy seemed pretty threatening, and like you're just like, fine, just take the ladder, that's okay. Well, that's mediate, and it's probably proximate. These two are very gray. They run into each other really well, but we still use 2 words for it. So, mediate, you provided necessary material, but you don't do the deed. If you provided necessary material like 1 step away, or you were real close to doing it, that's proximate. We would still say there's probably there's probably sin there. And especially if it's a grave act, there's probably, maybe not a super grave sin, but you know, this is something we should be worried about. This is something that we really don't really like to do, proximate material cooperation. And then we have remote mediate material cooperation. So, remote means that you're not really closely connected at all. And this is where Archbishop Hunthausen was. When we pay our taxes and our government does something unjust, our taxes pay for the unjust act. That happens, right? So we are cooperating in that act. However, we are very remotely cooperating in that act. We are separated by so many steps. Those taxes do go to an evil act, and I do pay those taxes, but I'm very separated from it. And so the way we evaluate whether we can do these things or not is there a reason that can justify it? We get to this point in morality where we realize we live in an imperfect world, and the only way to avoid any cooperation at all with any sin is to live on a mountain by ourselves, and even then maybe we're cooperating in some sort of sin, depending on where the mountain is. So, right, so how do you separate yourself from that? The church is realistic, and she knows you can't separate yourself entirely. So when we get to this level of cooperation, we ask ourselves, is there a compelling reason to do so? Archbishop Hunthausen did not believe that there was a compelling enough reason to do so to cooperate even remotely in paying his federal income taxes. Most archbishops in the country have made a different decision, and that's one of the reasons why he got in trouble, because he was a little off to the extreme in the opinion of the bishops of the world at the time. But it's still a question we have to ask. Anytime we know that we are cooperating materially, even if it's remote, we do have to ask ourselves, what is the compelling reason? What is the reason that I'm using to justify this? And so, a more contemporary example, this is the question that we're asking with the healthcare mandate. And this is why it's a debate in the church. So when the healthcare mandate came in and said, you have to pay into this system, and this system will provide free birth control, or depending on which source you use, abortion, abortifacients, whatever you want. But some people, our bishops, say that's true. So is there a compelling reason to do that? Is it a compelling enough reason? And so in a sense, it is debatable. When it comes to things like this, I generally try to trust the bishops because they're generally smarter than I am. And they've been doing this for a while. So generally that's who I go to. But when a Catholic theologian comes out and says the opposite thing, we can't immediately say that they're wrong. Because this is always a debatable area. It's always a question of weighing one evil against another, right? So for the income tax example, I have a compelling interest in supporting the infrastructure of my country, in supporting national defense. These are both good and compelling interests. The level of the money that I pay to national defense that goes to a nuclear arsenal, I can ask, is it an imminent threat? If it's not an imminent threat, does the other national defense justify the nuclear expenditures? And generally, most people would say, yes, it does. There's enough of a compelling interest in paying my federal income taxes and paying for national defense that I can cooperate in this remote way and still be okay. This is also the question we're asking about healthcare. When the government is compelling us to do something that we're not okay with, and it's less on the individual and it's more on, say, Catholic hospitals, right, or Catholic insurance providers. When the government is compelling these insurance providers to provide services that they find morally objectionable, at what level is that interest, right? At what level can they say, this is compelling enough that we will go along with it, that this is not? Most Catholic healthcare providers and everybody involved in the lawsuits right now have come to the conclusion that the interest is not compelling enough. They were able to provide adequate and reasonable health services before the mandate, and the mandate is not increasing their ability to do that. And buying into the mandate is not increasing their ability to do that. And some of these organizations have gone to the step of saying, we are even willing to be fined for not going along with this, because we believe that the interest is so not compelling. But, again, very hard, because there's always a debate when you're down here. When you're up here, it's easy. When you're up there, it's very easy. But down here, this is when we have to make prudent decisions, and when we have to really have the debates about numbers and details and power structures. And anyway, that's that. Questions?
Yep.
Reggie?
So going back to the nuclear thing, it complicates it too, because you have to understand the intention of the government. In other words,
right.
They might say, without nuclear weapons, we encourage the other person who has them to attack and kill. So the intention is not to use them. The intention is to have an offsetting arsenal, so there is no war.
Right. The opinion of the U.S. bishops at that time was that we should pursue nuclear disarmament. And so in that case, Archbishop Hunthausen was perfectly in line with all of his brother bishops in the country. And so he wouldn't really care about the intention of the government because the bishops are really pressing on the government to pursue disarmament and to really try to eradicate nuclear weapons from the earth. And so in that case, that didn't play into the debate. The debate was purely about trying to achieve this objective, which all of the bishops agreed on. Do I pay my taxes or not? He was one of the few bishops who said, no, I don't. The other bishop said, we can pursue this objective while still paying into national defense. Yeah?
With regards to civil disobedience,
Yeah.
something that you know that you're doing that is essentially going against a law or a rule of law in the country, like, say, sit-ins down during Jim Crow or something like that.
Yeah.
When does that become, like in the case of the nuclear issue, is he looking at it more like this is just a method of civil disobedience? If I don't pay these, I'm going to get arrested, but, you know,
Right.
you're standing by your values.
A slide that I did not put in here because I thought the presentation was going to be longer than it was on human law. So everything we've been talking about so far is divine law, how we respect that, how we play into that. But then the church has compelling teachings on human law. Human law is binding on a person's conscience. It is morally binding, according to Catholic thought, if it is promulgated by a legitimate authority based on reason for the common good. If any of those three aren't true, you don't have to listen to the law. So if it's unreasonable, if it's somebody saying, I just really want this, so I'm just going to do it, like a king, right? Tyrants, whatever. That's an unjust law. You don't have to do that. If it's not oriented toward the common good, so I'm passing a law specifically so that I get more money. Like I'm a legislator and I'm saying this law says Jeff Moore gets twice as much money as everybody else in all cases. That would be unjust because it's not for the common good. Or if I'm not a legislator and I pass that law, well, I'm not a legitimate authority. But if those three are matched, then you are morally bound to respect the law based on Catholic tradition. From the first letter of Peter, where he says, obey the emperor, even when he's killing you. He doesn't actually say that, but he does say obey the emperor. We've been saying that since the beginning. So we do respect legitimate authority unless it's an unjust law. Now, that's again where we get into this debate. If it's a just law promulgated by a legitimate authority based on reason for the common good, as the healthcare law could be justified as being, certainly a legitimate authority, they made reasoned arguments even if we might have disagreed with some of them. But it was based on reasoned arguments, and it was for the common good. In a sense, we're bound by that. And so the question we're asking again is, does the morally binding effect of true law, of human law, outweigh the remote material cooperation? And so in some cases we would say yes. Generally in taxes today we would say yes. In the case of distributing Plan B, we might say no. That is a grave enough issue because it's dealing with human life, and the direct killing of human life is so grave that the governmental interest does not outweigh our moral interest. But when you get to this level of morality, the church doesn't have easy answers. It's always individual theologians or individual bishops using their own study and prayer to come out with answers, and then we as individual Catholics using our own faith life and classes like this to try to understand where they're coming from and try to integrate that into our own life. So on the level of detail and on the ground level, it's very personal, and it's very, you really do have to educate yourself, otherwise you're kind of lost. And that's why I rely on the bishops, because if I rely on them, I don't have to educate myself. That's not true, but I do rely on them. Okay, we're going to come back to this at the end. So if you have questions about this at the end, we'll come back to that. There are two things that we also have to be careful of. Even if we are not sinning, even if we are not doing the evil act, these two things can lead it to the level of sin. So seduction is trying to entice a person to do something evil. Think about a playground, right? Everybody's around and do it, you should totally do it, do it. Well, that person didn't actually commit the act, right? The person saying do it. But that is seduction. You're trying to lead the person to do the evil act. And so this, we would say, is a sinful act, even though it's not based on the act. Again, the church has really thought about all the ways we rationalize, and so you can't say, I didn't actually do it. No, you caused the person to do it. You were an immediate cause of that. So that's seduction. Don't do it. It's a sin. Scandal is also very interesting. Scandal is doing something that leads somebody else to believe that a sin is okay. And so this is something the seminary has beat into my head. I, as a seminarian, am a public representative of the church. So the actions that I take are seen, generally, by people as being a representation of church teaching. So if I do something that appears sinful, or that somebody might assume is sinful, that will let them believe that it's okay for them to do too. So one thing they told me to be very careful of, for example, is going, even if it's just a meeting about faith, or like we wanted to schedule a meeting and not meet at the parish offices, going to coffee shops with young women, right? It might be perfectly innocent. We might be talking about, how she wants to be a nun, right? That's great. But for me as a seminarian, as a young man, to be seen at a coffee shop with a young woman by a parishioner, they could infer the wrong thing. Now some people would say, well, that's totally on them, right? Like they shouldn't be in your business, they shouldn't be inferring things. But, especially as a public representative of the church, I have to be very careful about scandal. I don't want to let people believe that something is okay when it's not. Even if I know why I'm doing it, or even if I think there are ways to justify it, I can't lend scandal to people. And so this is one of the reasons why some bishops would like us to be harder on Catholics in public life, say Catholic celebrities or Catholic politicians. Because in a sense, when they are a public person and they put the label Catholic to them, they have to be held to a higher standard than the ordinary layperson, because in a sense they're speaking for the church. And when they do something or say something that would lead other people to believe that it's an okay thing to do or say, that's lending scandal. And if it's a sinful act that they've done, scandal increases it. Scandal makes it a graver act. If it's not a sinful act that they've done, they still have to be aware of scandal and the possibility of that being a sinful thing for them to do. Sorry. There's one other thing I wanted to say about scandal. I guess I'll come back to it. Yeah?
In understanding words and as we're dealing with it, narcissism, in that, how does it fall into the possibility? Does it go into being a sin?
Well, it depends if it's habitual. So if it's a habitual thing or if it's a personality thing, then the act of narcissism itself is not sinful. But the fact, if you're aware of it, the fact of not acting on it would be. Because narcissism, in strict Catholic terminology, we would call pride, right? That's the sin. Pride is the sin, and pride especially as leading to many more sins. The act of pride itself is really hard to pinpoint, but the effects of pride are pretty easy to pinpoint. And so oftentimes narcissism leads to destructive habits in your relationships and destructive habits in your workplace. And those are certainly sinful. And so in a sense, the fact of a habit of pride would be sinful, but in the same way that addiction would be, or in the same way that other destructive habits would be. Okay, this is the last thing I wanted to say about scandal. Scandal is one of those things where we say there has to be a reason to do something, right? So if I'm doing something that might be scandalous, but I have a very compelling reason to do it, I can still do it. But I do, again, have to weigh. I have to be aware of the possibility of scandal, and then I have to be aware of the reason I'm doing that thing. And if I can say there is a compelling reason, like this thing absolutely outweighs any scandal I might lend, well, that's fine. Just like, again, remote material cooperation. If there's a compelling reason when you get down to these minor things, then the church is like, yeah, okay, compelling reason, go for it. But it is something we have to be aware of. It's something that we have to be reasoning about. Okay, this is going to be a big one, so I will pause for questions. All right. This one's fun because everybody has the wrong impression about it. Let me enter into a situation with you here. Somebody's read the Catechism, and the Catechism uses a phrase like, the right to conscience is inviolable. You cannot violate it. And the inference from that is, oh, well that means if I don't think it's wrong, it's not wrong. That is not the church teaching. Please, if you take one thing from this night, that is not the church teaching. Your personal opinion about an act does not make it good or evil. Conscience is not an opinion. Conscience is a faculty of the soul. In a sense, it's a faculty of the will. And it manifests itself in two ways. The first is as it manifests moral obligation to us. What this means is that as a human person in a neutral state, you generally have an idea of good and evil, even from the get-go. And this is because of natural law. You as a human person observe nature and reason about it, and your subconscious, because of the way you're wired, recognizes good and evil in broad strokes. This is why almost everybody in the world will say it's wrong to kill another human being. Because in broad strokes, everybody observes nature and everybody reasons to that point. Right? And that's conscience manifesting itself. It's, in a sense, the built-in faculty of morality. The thing that helps you know, without formal study, what's right and what's wrong. It also manifests itself as the prudential faculty. So now that you've gone to morality class, it is much easier for you to sin because you have full knowledge of things. So I'm sorry about that. Conscience is what takes these principles that you know and applies them to specific actions. So generally, I know it's bad to cooperate in a sin. Conscience is what helps you have that debate. Am I removed enough from the sin? Is there a compelling reason? It's a prudential faculty. It helps you make the prudential decision. And so that's the two ways that it happens naturally. The thing about conscience, though, is it, like any other part of your soul, is affected by your will. Over time, you form your conscience. So as a child, and this is why we always think children are innocent, as a child, you generally haven't corrupted your conscience. You look at the world and you see things as they are. A lot of Christian theologians over the years, and I would hold to this too, would say something similar about atheism. You have to convince yourself into atheism. The natural response is an understanding of God, because looking at nature, you're wowed, you understand how amazing it is, and you just naturally believe in some sort of higher power. You have to specifically corrupt your reason to get to a denial of God altogether. Same thing with conscience. Over time, you can absolutely corrupt your conscience by forming a habit of malformed reason. So forming a habit of rationalization. Gosh, I like to do these things. The first time I did it, I really didn't feel good about it. But then I did it again, and I felt a little better about it. And then over time, I feel great about it. To the point where, after a while, my conscience says, go for it! It's totally fine! Well, that's not your conscience manifesting yourself in its pure state. That's the conscience that you've corrupted. You brought that on yourself. And so now your conscience does say it's totally fine. But, again, virtual intention, you brought yourself to this point. So the conscience is not inviolable in the sense that wherever your conscience is now is absolutely true. We have all made bad decisions or good decisions or corrupted our reason with passion or intentional ignorance. We've done that. The reason we go to classes like this is to ensure that we continue to form our conscience according to best practices. One of the reasons why I remained Catholic, even in high school, even in college, when faith was incredibly under attack, is because I came to a realization early on that the church was way smarter than me. Right? I had, when I made this decision, I had 13 years of life experience, which means I knew everything, right? and I had 13 years of life experience in 2 cities, in the United States of America, in an upper middle class household, right? I did know at that age that I didn't know everything. And I realized that the church was a great place to go because she has existed in every culture since Christ. She has existed in every time since Christ. And she has existed through all of these cultural ups and downs. and yet maintained a constant theology. So I deeply trust the church because she is so wise and so old and so knowledgeable. And so when we form our conscience, the first place we go is to Catholic teaching, because there's a good chance that we got something right in there. There's a really good chance. And so we try not to form our consciences in isolation. And in a sense, we have a duty to the church and to each other to form our conscience in community. And not just community of believers now, but out of respect for previous generations, to form a community with them. It's called the ecumenism of time, right? Today we have ecumenism of the whole church. Let's listen to every aspect of the church. But the Catholic Church continues to exist in the church penitent and the church triumphant, in heaven and purgatory. And we also respect those Catholics and their opinions. So we form our conscience in community, just like we worship in community, just like we do everything else as part of the body of Christ. So, formed over time. That said, the Catechism does say conscience is inviolable. This is why. If we go back to that chart with act and intention, an evil intention can make even a good act evil. If you act against your conscience is what tells you, even if you've misformed it, it's still the thing that tells you whether it's good or bad. So if you do something that you believe is bad, even if it's actually good, but if you believe that it's bad, you have an evil intention. And so even a malformed intention, even a malformed conscience can still create an evil intention, and that evil intention still takes what is a good act and makes it evil. And the church cannot compel anybody to do evil, even if they're wrong about it being evil. Right? Even if that person is wrong about it being evil, we still can't force someone to do something that they think is evil, because it tears apart their soul. Right? Back to that first principle. It's a dehumanizing act. This is why the church is so insistent today on conscience protection in the public sphere. Because, fine, the government believes it has a compelling interest to force us to do things we don't agree with. That's the government's opinion. But we know how damaging it is when you ask someone to act against their conscience. Right? And so if I, as a Catholic, am asked to act against my conscience, I'm not going to do it, because it's an evil intention and I believe I'm doing evil, and I'm just not going to do it. I'm just not. And I would really like the protection of law for that. But in a similar way, just as we're asking for protection from the government, the church does have built-in protection. She will not force somebody to do something that that person believes is evil, because it's so important not to act with an evil intention. But it doesn't get people off the hook because of virtual intention, right? A malformed conscience came from somewhere. And over time, somebody might have made bad decisions that led them to a place where they believe a whole lot of things that aren't right. They believe all of these good acts are evil and all of these evil acts are good, right? They're not in a good place. We're not going to make them act against their conscience, certainly. But we are going to strongly recommend that they go to morality class on Friday night. Because we know, from the outside perspective and from the perspective of the body of Christ, that their conscience is in a bad place and that it needs to be re-educated. And so that's why we continue to insist, even on those issues that, depending on which paper you read, the New York Times says a majority of Catholics disagree with, right? The church continues to insist on those because the polling doesn't tell us that we're wrong about the issue. Again, universal claim. The polling tells us that we have been really bad at forming people's consciences. And now we have to make a double effort to try to reform those consciences, which is very hard to do. If somebody has lived their whole life with a malformed conscience, it's very hard to bring them back. Yes, ma'am?
You talked before about language and matter.
Yes.
And in coming to this, the Holy Spirit, in the end, directs the church through all these processes, right? Is it possible that the church gets things right? I'll just use an example, like male ordination, male-only ordination.
Uh-huh.
They don't know why, and they don't explain it correctly.
Oh, yes.
And so what we're presented with a lot of theology. I've been in St. Thomas, one of them.
Right.
And that's us up on that regard, right?
Yeah.
So I can personally vote the idea that the church may well have that right, or have had it right up to this very moment in history, but they failed horribly to give an explanation for it very well. And it would
Yes.
be better if they hadn't put out all these other supposed explanations, like St. Thomas with women being sort of a different order of species.
Right, yeah.
So I think on a lot of things they've done now.
I think this is a really good point, and for the recording, I'll repeat this. The question is, even if the church is right about something, could she have used really horrible language to describe it? I'll answer that with two things. One, absolutely, and I can come up with so many examples. In Catholicism especially, we have an appreciation of the fact that the early church did a ton of things without understanding them. And it took us some number of centuries to finally be able to begin to articulate why we did them. So, one example, infant baptism. We did it and we could not justify it. It was so hard to justify for the first few hundred years. Right? People were debating it back and forth. Can we baptize infants? The eventual argument the church came down on was, we've been doing this sacrament this way since the very beginning. So the Holy Spirit led us to do it this way, even if we don't know why. I think your example of male ordination is really good. John Paul II made his arguments, but I would say his arguments were exactly that. The argument for the church for male ordination is we can't change the sacraments. We inherit them from Christ through the apostles. We have to do them that way forever. But I haven't found a really good way to talk about it, for example, to high schoolers yet, when I have to answer that question. Because it's hard. I know why I believe it, but then you start talking about symbol, and you start talking about, in what way does a priest symbolize Christ, and then it gets very abstract and it goes off the rails very quickly. So there's certainly things that we do today that we can't articulate well, but we do them because we know the Holy Spirit led them to us. The second thing I would say is, there are times when the church is the agent responsible for a malformed conscience. Sometimes because of this language thing, sometimes because of other things. Best example I can come up with is the Protestant Reformation with the indulgences. All right, we screwed up on that one. That was our bad. And in a sense, we precipitated much of the problem. Now, we fixed it, and we tried to repair it. So there's a question of how grave were the apostasies that we saw? How grave were the schisms? Schism is always grave. And I think Martin Luther, because he eventually left the church rather than trying to reform the church, can be held very accountable for his schism. But we take a little bit of responsibility for that because we formed the conscience in a certain way by our own action. We lent scandal, we caused the conscience to be formed in a bad way, and then we had to kind of pick up the pieces and fix it. We're still doing that today. We went through some crazy times in the 70s as far as the way we were teaching things, and a lot of people never got good moral formation as far as what the church taught. And so the question is, to what extent was it their willful act that brought their conscience to this place? To what extent was it our willful act as a church? And how do we fix it today? That all comes into play with this. Yeah?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the word schism. Can you...
Yeah, schism is just a split in the church. It's the Greek word meaning split. And so it's when two people say that they are the true church.
All right.
And so that's kind of what Luther did.
I thank you for the definition.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
Thank you. No, it's great. Please ask questions like that. And then, of course, we all have a grave obligation to form our conscience. So that's why when a priest is presented with someone who dissents from Catholic teaching, what I'm taught to do in seminary and what the best priests I've seen do is you can't berate the person, right? Because they're operating out of the conscience that they have formed. What we ask for people who dissent from Catholic teaching is to struggle with it, right? Like, I can't say that they're right. I can never say that because I do believe Catholic teaching. But I also basically say, I can't force you. I can't do that. I can only ask you to just hang with us. Hang with the church, struggle with the issue, read about it. Read the documents, read the books, read the catechism. Try to give us the benefit of the doubt if you can. But that's kind of where we are. And that's also one of the places where Pope Francis is coming from. When he talks about help people know the love of Christ, bring them into the church first, give them a home, then talk about morality. Because he understands, first people need to know Jesus Christ. That's the most important thing. And then over time, we'll work on the conscience. We'll help them understand Catholic teaching. That's the thing that comes later as they try to achieve sanctity. Last slide. This one's really key, especially for week number 4. Double effect. So this emphasizes heavily the fact that in Catholic moral teaching, we care about the act and the intention. We don't actually care as much about the effect. It matters, but what really matters is what you did and why you did it. And so double effect is one of the ways that we talk about an act that appears to have resulted in evil. Can we hold a person accountable for that? Can we say that's a sinful thing or not? And so these are the 4 principles of double effect. Okay, we'll do the train example. Well, ectoptic pregnancy is the classic example for this, but I really want to save that for week 4. So we're going to talk about the train example, the trolley example. The trolley example is horrific, but it comes up in philosophy a lot, so we're going to use it. There is a trolley barreling down the tracks, and you are standing at a switch in a Y. On one side, let's make it really horrific. Your mother is tied to the tracks, right? On the other side, 10 mothers, but not your mother, are tied to the tracks. All right, and you are at that switch. And currently the switch is oriented toward those 10 people. What do you do? So it's a horrific example, but if you've ever studied philosophy, this is the example they use. It's called the trolley problem. It's on Wikipedia. So it's horrific. Or there's a variant called the fat man trolley problem, where the guy gets pushed off the tracks onto the switch, or pushed off a bridge and he falls on the switch. But anyway, philosophy is fun. So here's how double effect works. You have to ask what the actual act is and what your intention is. Those are the questions that you ask. And then you ask about effect. So if I were to switch that to try to save the 10 people, but my mother died in the process, or if it were the other way, if it were oriented toward my mother and I switched that and the 10 people died, right? This is, first of all, I'm not responsible for tying them to the tracks, and I'm not responsible for the trolley going down the tracks. That's important to this example. So the question is the act that I'm doing morally good or neutral? Well, pulling a switch on a track is morally good or neutral, right? That's all I've done. I've switched a switch. It's not like a direct killing of somebody. So that's the act itself. And the act has 2 effects. It has the effect of saving the people that I've switched it away from, but it also has the effect of killing the people I've switched it toward. So that's where these next 3 things come in. Is the evil effect the means to the good effect? Okay, so in this case, it's hard to think about that. The means to the good effect is switching the switch, right? It's not killing those other people. It's not the death of the other people that brought about the life of the other person. We get confused with double effect because it looks like it. You can say, well, in order for those people to live, this person had to die. But neither of those are the act itself, right? The act itself is switching the switch. And so the evil effect comes about from switching a switch. It doesn't come about from directly killing other people. The evil effect is tolerated but not intended. So again, this is why it's important that I didn't tie them to the tracks and I didn't cause the trolley to go. The evil effect is not what I wanted to happen. It's just what did happen. And then finally, the good effect has to be balanced by the evil effect. So in this case, actually, you would normally favor the 10 people because at this level of double effect, you can make that argument. Right? You can weigh lives against each other, and you have to